For this last session of the Future of the American Child Cleveland journalism training, we're going to talk about a subject that is really woven through all of our previous conversations, and that is food insecurity. We heard from a speaker who talked about the issue of food as medicine. We've heard about the need to provide food packages to families as part of centering the social determinants of health in communities when you're providing health care. Well, now we have sort of the culmination of that, what it's going to require to ensure that food security is a central part of child well-being in your communities. And I'm so pleased that we're joined by Morgan Taggart. She is the Executive Director of Food Access Reaches Everyone, a community-based organization here in Cleveland. But you've also worked with Case Western. You've just, your 20-year, how many years?
Yes, Rachel,
20 years.
Yeah.
Record of advocacy and research and really action in this area in Cleveland. Are you a Cleveland native?
No, Californian.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, tell us about how you arrived in Cleveland.
Back in 2004, I came to Cleveland. I originally started working at the Cleveland Botanical Garden at that time in urban agriculture. So I was working with a youth program focusing on growing food and entrepreneurship and using vacant land in the city. I then moved to Ohio State University Extension, where I worked for about 10 years. Was one of the founders of the Cleveland Cuyahoga County Food Policy Coalition. So we did a lot of policy and advocacy work, as well as a lot of training programs and technical assistance for urban agriculture projects. So community gardens, school gardens, market gardens, urban farms. And then it's really been, I think, a growth of where and how I think I can have the most impact on food systems has really been guiding me. And I would say the last 5 years or so really focused more on investing in people and community leaderships and grassroots organizations who are led by people most affected by the issues around food justice, food sovereignty, and access to healthy food. And so we do a lot of support. We do grant making with those groups and also act as a convener and collaborator, bringing people together. As you may have kind of come up in discussions over the last few days, the food system can be very disjointed and disconnected. So we also aim to bring all those pieces together and figure out ways that we can kind of catalyze really that expansion so every family in Cleveland has access to the food that they need.
Keep in mind these terms, food justice, food apartheid, I've heard that.
Absolutely.
So I was telling Morgan that yesterday morning I woke up and turned on the TV, and the very first story that appeared on the news was about something called the West Side Market here in Cleveland. And apparently the theme fits exactly into what we're talking about today in terms of who has access to what, or fresh food and whatever. So why don't you fill them in on what's going on here in Cleveland with that?
Yeah. Has anyone made it across the bridge to the West Side Market since you've been here?
Oh, you did? Oh,
okay, great. Yeah, so our West Side Market is what's known as a public market. That would be similar to Pike Place in Seattle. These are Eastern Market in Detroit. So these are often, and were often, owned by the city. They were a municipal market that brought in food vendors that really emerged in the progressive era of like the 1920s, 19-teens. As a way to kind of manage actually food safety and public health by offering some regulation and infrastructure to food vendors who were bringing their food into the city to sell. And so our West Side Market was founded in 1912. It is somewhat unusual nationwide in terms of public markets because it has been and continues to be, although it's in transition, which I can share a little bit about, under ownership and management of the city of Cleveland. I think as a result of that, we've got, I think around 70 food vendors at the West Side Market that almost feels like a step back in time if you are able to head over there. I mean, Cleveland was a city of immigrants, and I'm sure you've been learning a lot about Cleveland the last few days. 1950 was kind of our peak population at around 1 million. Right now we're at around 370,000. But there were a lot of Eastern European immigrants that came to Cleveland, and you still see that tradition at the West Side Market in terms of all sorts of Eastern European meats and sausages and pastries. But it's a pretty lively marketplace. I think because it's been under city ownership and management, you still see a lot of fresh food vendors, a ton of butchers, bakers, produce vendors. We don't have a lot of prepared foods in that space quite yet, simply because there's not the HVAC infrastructure. And there's been kind of dovetailing into the story and segue into the story, there's been a lack of big investment in the kind of capital and infrastructure needs of the market. And so there's a lot of deferred maintenance around the basement, HVAC, the roof. It's been struggling, as Cleveland has been struggling as a city in terms of its tax base and economic base. And so I should also mention, I was mentioning to Rachel, West Side Market was one of at least 3 public markets in the city of Cleveland. There was also the Central Market, which is now where the baseball field and the basketball arena now sit. There used to be a Central Market, same setup, tons of vendors, local entrepreneurs selling food. And then there was also one on the east side of Cleveland in what is now the neighborhood of Glenville. Both East Side Market and Central Market were owned by the city. They've both closed. Central Market was raised to build the stadiums. Eastern Market closed back in around, I think, 2007. Reopened a few years ago with a suburban grocery store that moved into that space, but that has really, really struggled. So West Side Market is our last kind of remaining gem, and what the conversation is around now. And as you also may have heard, we have a new mayor in the city of Cleveland after Mayor Jackson had been here about 16 years. And Mayor Bibb ran on transitioning the West Side Market to private management. So a new nonprofit corporation was just set up in the last couple of months to take over management of the West Side Market. And he's asked for $20 million in ARPA funding, American Rescue Plan Act money, to make a reinvestment in the market. And what you've seen emerge over the last few weeks is, I think, indicative of the layers of conversations around local food and food justice. The controversy is basically that City Council has said we are not going to fund the infrastructure of the West Side Market. We have a lot of other pressing needs in the city of Cleveland, and investing in a space, I think this is not a direct quote, but basically where people from the suburbs can come into the city and play city for the day by shopping at our West Side Market. It does not benefit the majority of residents in the city. There has been 1 or 2 Black-owned businesses in the West Side Market, and it's a 110-year history. And we are a Black majority city. So I think, for council people, and it's a lot of council people on the east side, which is majority Black, also kind of suffered, I think, a lot of the devastating effects of redlining, economic injustices, as well as divestment in terms of its community. They don't even have grocery stores, and you're asking us to spend $20 million on the West Side Market, and our folks aren't welcome there as vendors, or haven't had the chance to sell there as vendors, and even from an economic perspective had that opportunity, but our families also don't shop there. So this does not benefit the city, and you now have a nonprofit corporation that is headed by the former president of the Gun Foundation. You can get your own money together, and you want to transition it to a nonprofit. So, it's a very, I think, interesting conversation. The latest that I heard, I was at the West Side Market yesterday. One of the projects that we do is a program called Produce Perks, which I can talk about a little bit, but we're going to be at the market giving out about $30,000 in coupons to TANF-eligible families on May 20th. But the talk with the vendors was that the city is now talking about a $10 million allocation, so about down from half. So I think it's just, kind of a really interesting case study of the conversation here in Cleveland on where our public funding goes, how we have a widening gap between have and have-nots in this city, despite, I think, a lot of the stories about Cleveland's resurgence. Cleveland has revitalized in certain pockets, but definitely not in others. Another recent story that popped up in my feed yesterday with Signal Cleveland. I don't know if you've heard from those folks. There was a man on the east side that spray painted on the outside of his house, "Please tear this house down, Mayor Bibb," in bright red spray paint on the house next door that had been vacant and abandoned for years. Finally, it's getting raised as of a couple days ago. So we just have these, very inequitable, I think, systems that you see on full display in our city, and it's a real challenge for communities. It's also a real challenge for our elected officials in our city with limited resources to kind of figure out where do we put those resources.
Wouldn't it be nice if we lived in a world where the city would say, let's spend $20 million putting a grocery store in a community where people need it?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a boutique market.
Yeah.
Just let's get. Anyway, that's another conversation. Why don't I let you take over with your presentation, and we'll talk afterwards.
Sounds great. The other interesting thing when it comes to food access and ARPA,
The American Rescue Plan dollars, is also that the city allocated around $5 million to the food bank at the outset of when those funds came into the city. And I think Cleveland got somewhere in the ballpark of $517 million in ARPA funds that came to the city. I think it's within the top 10 of communities that received ARPA funding in terms of the total amount. So we spent $5 million on the food bank. And what's interesting about the food bank is also how that is shifting dynamics when it comes to food access in our communities. There's a recent dissertation done by a PhD student at Case Western Reserve at the Weatherhead School of Management, which is our business school at Case Western. And she was looking at the kind of silent competition that the food bank plays in our communities. And I've been hearing this from small store owners and grocery store owners for years, that they bring in all this free produce into our communities. How am I supposed to stock it in my store and charge people for it? So she was actually looking at some of the dynamics of pantry locations and meal locations and how that impacts the market feasibility of a grocery store in those communities, and found that for each pound of free produce that's distributed in a neighborhood, it leads to a $2.50 loss of produce sales for that grocer. So while the investment in our food banking system is vital and necessary, it's also having unintended consequences in our communities where the viability of operating a full-service grocery store just becomes more and more challenging when you actually layer on things like land assembly, when you layer on things like leakage, like security, like all of those other issues, I think, that are pretty complex in the urban context when it comes to grocery store development. So the city's position on how to kind of figure out how we address this grocery gap is something I think that they're wrestling with. I just met with a few members of the Bibb administration yesterday to talk about grocery stores. And I think that there is a growing acknowledgement that we need to accept that we may not be able to bring grocery stores and supermarkets back into the city as we had hoped. We are continuing to lose grocery stores in the city of Cleveland. I think our last big supermarket closed about a year ago in the North Collinwood neighborhood. Dave's Supermarket is kind of our key local grocer in this community, but because of the pressures of the pandemic, grocery delivery, Instacart, Amazon, it's created, and not to mention supply chain disruptions, it's created what is increasingly a business that operates on very slim margins to become even more difficult. So we've seen major consolidation here in terms of grocery store and supermarket access. So that's kind of, I think, another challenge for the city is what are those alternative models that we might need to look at in the city? How do we leverage our current assets in a space where I think we have about 400 corner convenience stores in the city of Cleveland right now? So we have, these independent grocers and all of these different neighborhoods that are often small, often focus on maybe not the healthiest foods, alcohol, cigarettes, lottery, but can they be partners as we, I think accept some of these market pressures on grocery stores means that because of our median income as well as our population density, and I don't know if you've had a chance to explore the city, there are some neighborhoods where you've only got 10 people on a block and there's a ton of vacant property. I mean, I think the city of Cleveland has around 20,000 vacant lots right now that they're trying to kind of figure out how to use to really spark economic opportunity and revitalization. But it definitely creates challenges in that kind of food access space where you want everyone to have access to healthy food in the city. So.
Hi, my name is Rachel Cohen. I write for Vox. Just listening to you describe some of the recent challenges, I was just also curious how inflation and the rise in grocery prices has affected these pressures on grocery stores, and has that accelerated it with them having to raise prices, or does that help them because it makes them more money maybe?
Yeah, I was just talking so the West Side Market has around, I want to say 18 fresh produce vendors. And so I was there Monday working with some of them and getting ready for this event that we're having. And they were telling me grapes are twice the price now. And because I was asking, I was like, well, you guys got a good crowd for a Monday afternoon. And they're like, but no one is buying because they are primarily purchasing from the produce terminal, and that is on the Near East Side where a lot of it's kind of like a hub for all the international produce that's coming into the city as well as local product. And so they have to pass that directly onto their customers. So it is definitely, I think, affecting their sales and their bottom line, just making it more and more difficult for them to survive. Yeah, big pressures there. And I think that plus some of you may have heard that the SNAP allotment changed March 1st. So you have continuing grocery prices that are still rising, but the SNAP, so during the pandemic, basically the federal government said we're going to offer the max allotment for every family. There's a lot of stuff that goes into the algorithm that determines how much you get per month for SNAP, the program formerly known as food stamps. And so those levels dropped back down to pre-pandemic levels, which for some families meant a loss of $200 a month that they would get in SNAP benefits. So you kind of couple that with those rising prices, and it really creates a difficult environment. Just to piggyback on that, when you think about grocery stores operating in poorer communities, and Cleveland is one of those, some of our grocers, about 85% of their purchases are SNAP. So when you remove and reduce SNAP monthly allotments for families, that also puts incredible pressure on those grocers in terms of how they survive. Because basically you are, cutting their revenue by some serious percentages, which makes it a lot more difficult for them to kind of adjust and make those changes too. So you'll often see grocery store partners really advocating for SNAP as well, because any changes to those really affect their bottom line. Any other questions before we? Okay. And I'm hoping, was there? Yeah.
Hey there.
Hey.
My name is Eli.
Eli.
You'll probably get to this, but I'm just wondering how you're thinking about the school meal waivers and the expiration for that, and the stipends, as well as the after school funding, as well as the placement of where the meals need to be and all of that, and how that's figuring into the emerging picture of food disparities in the city.
Yeah, and we can definitely dig into that a little bit, because I think having done some work with the Cleveland Public School District around farm to school and school meals, I think, and I think one of the kind of the themes that I really want to leave you all with is how do we incorporate young people's, youth, and children's perspective in these issues, because I think we often miss that. We talk at the policy level, we talk at the systems level, we talk to adults, but when you think about how youth are accessing food in their daily lives, it's a very different pattern than many adults. So we'll definitely get to that. Anything else before we, not to make you keep getting up and down back there? Okay. But yeah, please, this is a conversation and discussion. So So I wanted just to give you a little bit of background on the work that we do, so you kind of understand the context with which we approach, I think, some of these challenges and these issues. So FAIR, where food access races everyone, we were a project that emerged from the Food Trust in Philadelphia. They do both work locally in Philly, but are also a national level organization working on food access and improving food access. They were one of the founders of the Healthy Food Financing Initiative. If anyone's familiar with that, that's a funding mechanism that comes through USDA, Health and Human Services, and the Treasury at the federal level to support grocery store development in low access communities. And so we were a project of the Food Trust and became independent and a part of Cleveland back in 2019. And so we do a couple of different types of programs here in Cleveland. We, as I mentioned, we bring people together. We do citywide convenings, kind of bringing people together across the sector. We also have an initiative called Community Collective. So basically, we're bringing grassroots leaders and community members together that not only look at food access, but look at how food access connects with community safety, how it connects with after-school programming, how it connects with the other social determinants of health, quality jobs, education. So I think, 15 years ago, food was seen as food. And it sounds like you've heard from some folks around food as medicine. It's really understood that food is just one of a complex, I think, series of factors that are a part of people's lives and the environments in our neighborhoods in Cleveland and across the country. We also do work with small stores, with corner convenience stores. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of times those are kind of the last remaining outposts for food access and kind of general grocery in communities, not to mention fast food and takeaway food. That's a whole other piece of it. But we work with our small grocers. We do a program called Heart Smarts, which is basically nutrition education. We do healthy recipes in these stores, and then we give them what we call Heart Bucks, which is kind of a part of our nutrition incentive. We're trying to address this issue by kind of the supply side as well as the demand side. So working with store owners to figure out how they can source produce right now. Many, I would say maybe 90% of those stores are going to Aldi or Costco or Sam's Club and buying their produce and bringing it to their store and marking it up, which also leads to, I think, some of those challenges when it comes to why is this more expensive in my neighborhood than it is at a big grocery store. And it's because there's no produce distribution system that will serve small stores. Because of the consolidation in the industry, you've got a couple large produce distributors, and they are like serving the Krogers, the Giant Eagles, the larger format supermarkets or restaurants. And so the smaller stores really just, the food system isn't serving them. And so they buy that retail and then sell it retail. So we really try and work on both sides of that. The nutrition incentive programs are, I would say, a growing strategy within the last 15 years or so. So that shows up in a couple of different ways. We have a program in the state of Ohio called Produce Perks. Sometimes it's called Double Up Food Bucks. Has anyone heard of these programs before? So these are a matching program. So when I go to, let's say, my local supermarket and they're a participant in a program like Double Up Food Bucks or Produce Perks, I spend $10 on my SNAP card, I get $10 extra to spend on fresh produce. So it's helping to address some of the higher costs, both reality and kind of perception around fresher food, and providing a direct subsidy to that customer to be able to purchase fresh fruits and vegetables. You also see that with the WIC program, as well as the Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program. Oftentimes they will add an incentive to purchase fresh fruits and vegetables. Another kind of program that's wrapped up in the nutrition incentives is produce prescription programs. We have been offering those in Cleveland, I think, over 10 years. We are about to launch a new partnership with Cleveland Clinic that will be using produce prescriptions for people who are diagnosed with diabetes or pre-diabetic. And so they'll get anywhere from $30 to $150 a month depending on family size, to spend on fresh produce. They'll be able to spend that in a network of farmers markets and also a couple retail locations. We've also seen that produce prescription model when we first started in Cleveland was actually focused on pregnant women and women with small children, really trying to, I think, provide some resources and support to address that kind of infant mortality, racial disparity that we have here in Cleveland, but that we also see across the country. So those are helping to drive the demand side, giving people purchasing power to purchase these healthy products in their stores, at their local farmers markets, and then also working on that supply side to make sure that we have a distribution system and supply chain that's actually bringing those healthy foods into the community as well. Let's see. This is pre-pandemic when we all used to get together all the time. We're slowly bringing those back. So kind of around our approach to this work, right? I think for FAIR, and as I kind of mentioned in the intro, I find that kind of the nonprofit world has really not designed these programs often for the people who are recipients of them. And so we really wanted to flip that on its head, both from who we hire on our team as well as how we approach that work. So we really focus on community-led, community-driven solutions to food insecurity, to food access. And so we design our programs, our initiatives with those folks kind of at the center who are most affected by these issues. And I think, we see the impact of that when we do in nutrition incentive programs. We were in a collaborative with Philadelphia, San Jose, Indianapolis, and Cleveland. We had redemption rates of our coupons around 95%. All of the other communities were hovering around 45 to 50%, because we hired people who know their communities, who can connect with people in their community, so you have better utilization of these programs and better impact. We also provide a lot of capacity and support and technical assistance to a lot of groups, and really trying to, as I mentioned, think about food, but also the context and the community in which they're operating. And then really just trying to kind of be out there, be action oriented, but also using what we have. We're going to talk a little bit actually about some of the terms that you'll often hear in food work, food access, food justice, food sovereignty, and I kind of want to define those a little bit with you all. But asset-based is kind of working in opposition to that term food desert, right? I think for desert, people think there's nothing there. And oftentimes our communities have a lot of assets that we can leverage and support and expand to improve access to healthy food in the short term. So these are kind of some of the projects that we're currently working on. As I mentioned, we have an ongoing partnership with the Westside Market. We worked with the city back in 2021 to develop the revitalization plan for the Westside Market. And now we are working at the market to bring Produce Perks to that market. So we will be there on May 20th, and I think we've got around $30,000 worth of produce coupons that we will be giving away to TANF eligible families. And then we also are rolling out a produce prescription program there as well this year in partnership with Cleveland Clinic. We also do a Food Justice Fellowship with Case Western Reserve University, and actually graduation is tonight. So it's a 6-month fellowship for community leaders who have an idea about how they want to address food justice in their community. So we help them take it from that kernel of, I think I want to do this, all the way into that action phase. And the focus for this year was children and families. So all of the fellows had projects that were somehow related to sparking and expanding food justice for children and families. So we have someone who's developing an app called North Star CLE, where he is putting all the pantries, the meal programs, the farmers markets, the grocery stores, the healthy corner stores in one location. So children and families can figure out where to get healthy food in their neighborhood. We've got a couple folks that are starting community education farms for youth employment in the summer. Another one, Shine Bright, and she owns a vegan restaurant on the east side, and she really wants to work with federally funded food programs for youth. How do we improve school lunches, breakfast programs, after school programs, and really get fresh, healthy foods into those venues? We also do work with small food retailers. We've got a program on urban beekeeping with Global Cleveland, using beekeeping as a way to kind of bridge people across lines of difference, whether they're newcomers, refugees, immigrants, neighbors, east side, west side, using beekeeping as a way to kind of bring people together and introduce more people to urban agriculture. And then we've got a couple other projects we've been working in the central neighborhood of Cleveland, which is just east of downtown, on a resident-led initiative to start their own food co-op. Their grocery store left in 2019. And so they've been kind of grappling with how do we address this in our community. That's also Cleveland's neighborhood that has the highest concentration of public housing. And so we just received a grant to really help bring some resources to that planning process, and are looking to a similar co-op in the Dayton area called Gem City. So really thinking about how do residents address this when the market basically has failed them. And so they're really trying to figure out how they can put a store together in their neighborhood that can supply fresh food for their community. And then our last big initiative that we're just launching is a neighborhood-based initiative also focused on children and family, that's making a deep investment in the grassroots organizations in those neighborhoods that are engaged in school gardening, community gardening, urban farming, meal programs, and also in tandem with that investment, figuring out how those folks can work together. Again, a lot of these entities often just do their one thing. And so we've paired a community center with the urban farm, and the urban farm is providing farm shares through the community center and the early childhood education center to families take home when they pick up their kids. So kind of figuring out how do we build those connections in community and really invest in the people who I think are often overlooked, right? They aren't the big fancy projects or organizations, but they're the ones on the block growing food. Kids pass by on their way home from school. And they are assets in their community. And so we've been trying to kind of figure out how do we make that investment and also build their capacity to address some of those issues. These are some of the kind of other advocacy work that we're doing. We are also working really closely with a group of growers as well as USDA to address some of the kind of legacy of structural racism in USDA in terms of Black, Latin, Hispanic, and Asian farmers and indigenous farmers from accessing their resources. So we just had a town hall a week and a half ago. We had about 75 urban growers there, as well as folks from USDA, both the Farm Service Agency and National Resource Conservation Service, to really figure out how do urban growers and limited resource farmers kind of access their programs where they have been historically shut out from those programs. We're working on some green space initiatives, and we've got our community collective that we're also working on with some kind of up and coming development issues in their neighborhood around a poultry processing facility and the impact of that on the neighborhood. And then continuing to work on our Produce Perks Midwest. We've got a $1 million request in the state budget right now to expand that program.
Hi, I'm Mary Flum. I'm with NBC News.
Yeah.
Your information is all incredibly interesting and helpful, and you're already giving me a dozen story ideas to follow up on. I was intrigued by a couple of things that you brought up, which I wasn't aware of. For example, these local corner stores, basically what's left in these neighborhoods. Two things. One, that they're going to places like Aldi and buying and then marking things up. One question I have is, well, what's the response? I mean, obviously the food's more expensive. And in general, just, something that we've been talking about, and I know as a parent myself, I mean, there's just such a cultural shift, right, in the last 50 years for how much people are cooking, how they're cooking, produce in general. Do you have a sense of like quote unquote best sellers? Because you do have a lot of single parents, working parents, they don't have a lot of time for food preparation. So if you are targeting what to put into those corner markets, do you have a sense of, what they will buy, especially if there's a markup, what is a little less perishable or that the kids could eat healthy? You mentioned like the grapes, those are great for kids, but if there's that markup, yeah. I'm just wondering if you have a sense of what to kind of target where these households you can find that happy medium. I don't know if there is that happy medium to be found, but I was wondering if you have some kind of market research, so to speak, especially if those stores are so small. And as you said, they're selling lotto tickets and alcohol, and those are the big sellers, as well as kind of the faster food. So what do you target if you have, a limited audience and resources?
Yeah, that's a great point. And it just kind of, for me, helps unpack, I think, some of the economics of corner stores. Like you said, in Cleveland, there's definitely tobacco. And I don't know if you've heard from anyone talking about public health policy, but there is a lot of discussion. We went to Tobacco 21 a few years ago, so you have to be 21 to buy tobacco in the city of Cleveland. Now they are looking at a flavored tobacco ban. So flavored tobacco, menthol, will be gone from stores, and corner stores are extremely threatened by that loss of revenue. And so that's kind of where they are right now in terms of, their revenue, like we said, lottery, alcohol, tobacco. And then the other interesting thing about corner stores that's, I think, different from the grocery and supermarket format is that the Frito-Lay person comes in, they stock their own stuff, they make sure it looks great, they put everything together. The Pepsi person does the same thing, the Budweiser person does the same thing. There is not a produce person that comes in and does that work, right? The dairy comes in, they got the cheese, the eggs, the milk, they stock it, they make sure everything looks good. So there is no equivalent to the fresh produce side of things. And so it's extra work for the store owner and their employees regardless. So the extra trip to Aldi's, the stocking it, what we found, and so with our Heart Smarts program, we interact with about 80 customers every Wednesday in 2 different stores. And we often ask, what do you want to see here? And it is kind of the basics: apples, oranges, bananas, grapes, fruit cups, peppers, onions, tomatoes, potatoes, sweet potatoes, things like maybe hardy greens like collards and kale, but lettuce greens are just too much. They require too much maintenance, right? You think about the sprayers in the grocery store, keeping them fresh and lush, and you gotta keep it moving, right? It can't really sit there. Those other things are relatively shelf stable, don't require a ton of refrigeration. So those are often the core products that you'll actually see in stores. And so it's a combination of some produce, but then also a lot of grab and go. So we have a young woman in Cleveland who's got a business, Fruitalicious, and she does fruit cups and almost does it like the way Frito-Lay does. She comes to the store, she stocks her own stuff, she works at a local grocery store, gets that fresh fruit that's about to go, kind of those seconds. So she gets it at a discount. It's very affordable. It's on consignment, so she only gets paid for what sells. So to me, there is kind of the service piece of that fresh food side that needs to pivot to better serve stores. And then it's also what you said, what does the customer want and what does that inventory look like? And I think based on lack of refrigeration, you think about a corner store, a lot of their coolers come from their beverage distributors. So they're also not willing to give up that space that could go to Budweiser or Pepsi per their contract to produce. And so when you think about, like you said, what's available in a store in terms of the distributor, the service that they're getting and where it can go, and not to mention the products, it becomes very, very tricky very fast. Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of ground us, and it sounds like you've had kind of different pieces of food systems discussions throughout the last few days, but we talk a lot about the food system, and that includes a lot of components. So just kind of level setting so we're all in the same space. And when we talk about local or regional food systems, we're talking about how these players interact with each other, right? How does the farmer interact with the distributor that interacts with the West Side Market or the grocery store, and then the end consumer, and then what happens at the end? So how do we, from a food system perspective, really tie all those folks together and build those partnerships and relationships that are equitable and kind of have mutually kind of beneficial connections throughout the system? And so we talk about growing, processing, storing, distributing, transporting, and selling, and also the waste side of food. There's been a lot of really great stories about the amount of food waste that we have in this country, and this kind of strange paradox that we live in where some people don't have enough to eat, yet we waste about 40% of the food that comes into our supply chain. So that's kind of a level set for kind of local food system. And this is kind of what it looks like when we look at those various components, right? We've got the production, it could be urban, it could be rural, it could be suburban, how that gets processed into value-added products, how it gets back to its markets, whether it's across the country, across the globe, or just a couple miles away, how it gets direct to consumers, so retails, markets, restaurants, the consumer, and then the waste. And it's really how all of these different pieces come together and also the context in which they're operating. So the other term that we hear a lot is food security. I'm sure that's kind of is one that you all are hearing a lot too. So really it's physical and economic access to nutritious foods at all times, right? And so food insecurity and hunger, I think, often get linked together. So when access is disrupted or limited, that's when food security insecurity occurs. It might be temporary or it could be long-term. And I think we see both of those. I think when we think about the pandemic, there was temporary food insecurity for a lot of families, right? Access to grocery stores, loss of jobs, stores closing, or it could be long-term, as many families in our region are experiencing as a result of poverty or poor access to food. And so when we talk about the elements of food security, there's really kind of 4 components of it. Is the food actually physically available in that community, right? And we've been talking about some of those issues right now. Is it actually in that neighborhood? Is it at that grocery store, that corner store, in schools? So this is really that supply side. And so that's determined by food production and also trade. Then we have kind of economic and physical access to the food. Can I get to it? Do I have a car if the grocery store is located 10 miles away? Do I have the benefits through SNAP, through WIC, through other cash allotments or support programs to actually purchase the food? Utilization is kind of how my body makes use of those nutrients too. And then stability. So that's what factor short-term, long-term, how this all fluctuates when it comes to food security. And so those are kind of some of the those 4 major elements that really determine food security. Now, food deserts is another term that I think has probably emerged in the last 15 to 20 years and is now kind of in the everyday lexicon, I think, for many Americans. And so this is, communities that have poor access to healthy, affordable foods. These are often concentrated in low-income and historically marginalized areas. These can be both urban and rural. I think a lot of the reporting has focused on urban, right? High population density, high amount of people impacted. But the rural issues around food access are just as stark. And some of you may have seen there's been a lot of good coverage around access to healthcare and rural hospitals closing. And it's the same thing with grocery stores. We had a county in Ohio that did not have, basically the last grocery store closed down. And it took a major intervention with some state partners and local partners to kind of identify an operator owner and get a grocery store opened up back in that community. So it's both urban and rural. I would say, there's a lot of pushback at the community leader and resident level around this term. And I think it comes to, in part, how we talk about the communities that are suffering the impacts of low access. The labels around underserved, under-resourced, at risk, food deserts. It feels like it's just another label that's defining my life when that's not always my full experience. And so I think there's been a real movement, particularly among community advocates and activists, to use the term food apartheid, which we'll talk about in a minute, because that really layers on history and power into that dynamic and not just a desert. I think for residents in these communities, they often feel like we do have food here. There's not life here. And so I think that there's been a
a lot more discussion around this term and people starting to use different types of language, which we'll talk about in a second. This is another, has anyone heard the term food swamp? So that's kind of really looking at that opposite of, we have a ton of fast food restaurants, we got a ton of corner stores, so we have an overabundance of unhealthy foods and a low density of access to fresh, healthy foods. So we are like swimming in junk food, basically, and fast food. And so that's another term that you'll often see in kind of stories around food access. And then this term food apartheid has really emerged, I would say, into kind of more common usage the last 5 to 7 years. It's really talking about the root causes, like why is this happening in these communities? Why do we see no grocery stores in some neighborhoods at all? And these are communities that don't have access to a car, so they can't hop in and like travel to Whole Foods in the suburbs. They're basically left without. And what does that really do to? And I think if you look at maps of redlining, supermarket access, household income, average home value, these things stack, and those darkest areas are just the same no matter what map you're putting on there. So there are structural issues that are happening in those communities that are leading to this. And so really it's coming down to, in this term around apartheid, it's really about power, it's about systemic racism, and it's about these health inequities that are a result of a kind of corporate and market-driven food access system. So, grocery stores will, because of some of the constraints we've talked about, often locate in other communities. And that's really in chase of the bottom line, right? The dollar. I think like a city like Cleveland is addressing or trying to figure out how food is a public good. Everyone should have access to this food. So if it's not a corporate model, what are those other options that we have? But what we see is kind of the drive for profit has driven grocery stores out of some of these markets. And then another term that we use a lot is also food justice. And that's really around that this is a right. People should have access to the fresh, healthy food that they need to live healthy, good qualities of life. And so when we talk about food justice, it's also community-led. It's participatory, meaning the people that are most affected by this issue are driving the change. And it's also locally grown, meaning it's in that local context. It's an outgrowth of that community, their history, their economics, the people that live there, the cultures of the people that live there. And it's really a manifestation of a local environment and its people to address those gaps when it comes to food access. And then this is a term developed by Case Western Reserve University and some of their literature the last few years. They've done some interesting work around mapping the dynamics of food systems and all of the different levers that are at play there. And they are bringing in, I think, a couple new concepts around freedom, agency, and dignity. So kind of that culturally relevant. Do you have the foods that you are used to? Having the choice. I think that's kind of one of the challenges I think community members often find of replacing grocery stores with food pantries. They don't have a choice. They'll get a bag of stuff. So having that kind of agency and dignity to be able to choose the foods that you want for your family is a part of that definition in nutrition equity. It also kind of wraps in economic opportunity, food security, and fair access. So in this definition, it's also around how can Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous farmers get their food into the store? How do we use our food system to create opportunity economically for the people in this community? So any questions about any of those terms or reflections? I think we often throw them around a little interchangeably, so I thought it might be helpful just to kind of lay out some of the nuances there. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I raised my hand before I heard the whole question. I don't have a question about the terms necessarily.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear more about that demand side because I know I've heard maybe just anecdotally, oh, we worked to get produce into this corner store and no one bought it, and for people who, just through circumstance and long history are not accustomed and so maybe don't desire fresh healthy food, or potentially, as we heard yesterday, know what to do with it or don't have time to go home and cook a meal.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear maybe later, but more about the work that you guys do on that demand piece.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it's I want to be I'm always want to be careful and intentional how I respond to that question, because I think the challenges that poor families face and the trends in food overall and how we eat in America are very aligned. They are not an outlier, I guess, is what I want to say, because I think there is a lot of judgment around poor people and SNAP benefits and food and controlling what they eat and what they don't eat and how they make choices. A lot of they, them. And I think, and you were saying this too, right? I mean, we all are shifting the way that we access food. There is a whole section of that produce aisle that is now pre-chopped, pre-peeled, ready to go. And so while I think there have been shifts because of the lack of access over time and exposure to new foods, I think what we found is when people are released from the economic constraints, and that is there was a paper that came out maybe about 7 years ago that really, I think, hammered in on families who have really limited food budgets and how they can't risk buying blueberries, because if their kids don't like blueberries, that's $4 down the drain. And so people's worlds in terms of their choices by survival, right, are what am I going to guarantee that my family will eat? And so that really limits your whole world of what you can try, especially when it comes to fresh foods that you may not be familiar with. So those economic constraints really drive families and their choices and don't allow for the opportunity to expand your palate, try new things, risk spending $3 for a bundle of asparagus if you're not sure how that's going to go over with your family. So when we talk about addressing some of those things, I think it's a combination, and that's what this Heart Smart program, which is a SNAP Ed program. So SNAP has a portfolio of nutrition education programs that are evidence-based. So it addresses the access issue by working with stores who have those products in store. It provides that incentive through that Heart Buck. So people have that extra money. They're released a little bit from that economic constraint to try something new, like trying the baked chips instead of the regular potato chips. It also provides nutrition education at the point of purchase. So we are in the store doing nutrition education. I think this week's lesson, we were focused on making healthy snack choices in a corner store, actually walking through the store with people, looking side by side as they're making a purchase. So it's like getting them in that moment when they're making a decision. And then we also always feature a recipe and a tasting with something that they can make using stuff in that store that's less than 5 ingredients and super easy to put together. And so I think in my experience, you kind of need to be tackling these issues from all of those angles at once: access, education, and economic, in order to help people and support them as they're making changes. That said, I think that there's tremendous opportunity in the ready-to-eat fresh space. I often, if I ever wanted to go into the business side of things, I have this dream of these ready-to-eat meals that could be available in corner stores that can take away. They're eligible with SNAP because they're cold, but there's a microwave right there if you wanted to buy it and then heat it up, because with SNAP, you're not allowed to buy hot foods. So I don't think we've had enough market experimentation in that space when it comes to convenient, fresh, and affordable that I think could be a really great fit for busy, working families who are kind of struggling. So long answer to your question, but I think there's no magic thing that's going to happen. We got to figure this out from all sides. I'd also say that this is where, to me, having people that are have that lived experience of being that person who is on SNAP, who's had to make hard food decisions, being that person in the store, talking to other people, sharing their tips for how they make it, things that they've tried, things that their kids like, is also that peer-to-peer interaction is so invaluable. Of kind of sharing your advice and your experience that helps from someone else who you think gets what you're going through, but is encouraging you to try something different. And I think that is also key in terms of supporting behavior change at the same time.
Hi, I'm Rania with NBC News. I just have a quick follow-up question about the lesson that you said that you'll do at the store where you'll take people and you'll show them like the produces that they can get. I was wondering, like, do people sign up for those classes before they go to the store, or because I understand that walking around and showing people produces, like, other people might, it's eye-catching, other people might start seeing what you guys are doing and join in. And I was wondering, like, how does that work?
Yeah, they know that we're going to be there for 8 weeks straight, same time, same day, every week. But we are catching people in the moment. And so it's meant to be a 5 to 10 minute conversation as you're coming into the store. And so, yeah, people don't sign up in advance. We want to reach people who other programs don't reach. We primarily reach, I would say, overall young Black men who are coming into corner convenience stores that are stopping for snacks, stopping for lunch, stopping for a couple groceries during the day. And that's a group that does not show up for the most part, a cooking class or nutrition education demonstration. So we really want to catch everyday people in the moment at the store when they're making a food choice. So yeah, we are there in the stores for about 2 hours, and I'd say we probably talk to about 50 people in those 2 hours. And the stores are small. I mean, they are probably half the size of this room. So teeny tiny, little stores. We've got a couple stores that are more like full size of this room. But yeah, so we've got 2 people there. So someone is kind of at the table doing the lesson, talking to people, and someone else can be free to kind of walk through the store and, help someone figure out what is 100% juice. This says 100% vitamin C on it, but it's actually not juice. It's still sugar water. They just added vitamin C to it. So helping people, like, in that moment, look at products side by side, understand food labels, and understand the choices that they're making.
Let's let Morgan finish her presentation and
How are we doing on
go to Q&A. Oh, we don't. Yeah.
11:30. Okay. We'll keep moving. Okay. So I just wanted to share a little bit about some of the policy and big stories that I think we've done in Cleveland around food access. As I mentioned, I think we were named number 2 in the country for urban agriculture and how we support urban agriculture in the city of Cleveland. That's producing, growing, distributing, selling food in cities. Some of the things that we worked on here in the city that captured a lot of attention both locally and nationally, we completely revised our zoning and land use regulations to support urban agriculture. Everything from chickens and bees to setting up farm stands on residential districts, which meant that if a vacant lot in a neighborhood was an urban garden, they couldn't set up like a table outside and sell their produce to the neighborhood. So we changed all of those regulations. Figuring out how to help urban farmers get access to capital, access to water, and access to land. So this was something that Cleveland really invested in on the kind of edge of coming out of that real estate crisis in 2008. And so we talked about, and this is just to kind of give you a sense, when you're reporting on something like, or telling a story about urban agriculture, I think the work that we had to do internally at the city is, I think, illustrative of how complicated these issues are, right? We had to work with the mayor and city council. We had to work with planning commission, who oversees all of our zoning and land use laws. So zoning and land use is often a locally controlled issue. Things like food safety are often state level laws that are then reinforced by local agencies. So we also had to work with our public health department, economic development in terms of accessing capital, community development, because they are the keepers of land bank lots, and the water department. So even though we were just tackling this one issue, we needed to come at it from all of these different angles. By the way, this is the West Side Market. I just realized. This is one of our urban growers on the east side. And so when kind of we're telling that story around urban agriculture, and I think from an advocacy perspective, I think there's some parallels to how journalists also tell this story. We really tried to kind of combine both the actual hard data and look at some of the limitations of quantitative data when it comes to food retail environments, and then the stories. That was so critical. And I'm sure you as journalists know this, right? It's the magical combination of these two things. It's talking to someone who is operating a garden for young people in their neighborhood, and it's also saying there are 200 of these amazing stories across our city. And so how do we combine these things and make sure we have a balance of both? Because just the data, plot points on a map aren't going to tell you the true story, right? Highlighting a couple residents or community leaders or young people who benefited from those spaces are really kind of what helps expand and builds the case for why this is important in our communities. And then oftentimes, how have other cities addressed these challenges, and what have the impacts, both good and bad, been of these changes? And so in terms of the storytelling that emerged out of this big policy push, and this was probably from about 2008 to 2014 in Cleveland, there were stories that came at this from the real estate market crash. Like, how do we deal with vacant property? How do we deal with the rising amounts of demolitions that we're doing in the city of Cleveland to create vacant land? Can urban agriculture save us? Was, I think, a lot of the framing of those stories. There was also the story that was emerging around, is this the opportunity to help us address access to healthy food in our neighborhoods that don't have grocery stores? Because that's been a long-term issue here. These are also spaces that provide spaces for people to meet each other. We have like I think a decline of those neutral community spaces that don't cost any money, that everyone is welcome and can hang out. And community gardens and urban gardens are a place to do that. And then there's definitely a youth angle. I would say, 60% of our urban agriculture projects have youth involved in some core component of that, whether it's school gardens, community gardens, entrepreneurship, field trips, school trips. So having more opportunities for youth to engage in their community around issues around sustainability, food access, justice, entrepreneurship, and economic development. And those were some of the other ways that this story was framed. And so when we kind of move from that urban agriculture example, right, where we're taking this really broad look and how this one strategy can really address a lot of our kind of community challenges. The other thing that has been emerging is how we really define the problem, right? And so one of the things that we were looking as we were mapping community gardens is also how we map food access. And so traditionally, what happens when we map food access, and we're using kind of GIS analysis to do that, we're looking at things like where the store is located, what the income level of that community is, and also the transportation access. How many people have access to a private vehicle for transportation? A lot of the store location data will come from your public health department. We also have an amazing kind of like ArcGIS user-friendly website called Fresh Finder that Case Western uses. It's through their NEAP initiative, where they're actually going in every single food retailer in the city of Cleveland every 2 years and updating a map. So you have a couple different sources for store location. The transportation and income data come from the Census and American Community Survey. And so when we look at those, this is our most recent one from 2022. You can see grocery stores here in black dots, and then you see low access to grocery using a combination of household income and transportation access. And you can see some of these communities where it's determined that there is low access, and other communities where it's accessible. Then they've got low population. So this is like our industrial valley where all of our steel manufacturing is. There's not a lot of people living down there. But when you look at this map, what do you think some of the limitations are? What story is this telling us right now? Yes, yep, absolutely. based on telling us this is where the stores are. Does it say anything about how people are interacting with those stores? Does it say anything about the quality of the foods in those stores? How people are treated in those stores? What the prices are in those stores? If those stores accept WIC, if they accept SNAP. And this is often what we use to say, this is what's happening in our community. But we are missing, I don't know, the bigger story, right? The bigger story is, what kind of food am I getting in that store? How affordable is it? So when I look at one of these stores, is it this one? Yeah. One of these stores where there's a full service grocery store, I find a half an dried up orange shrunk wrapped in some styrofoam for 35 cents. Is that what I'm getting? On the map, it says I'm fine, right? I got a grocery store. But this is the option in my produce section. What is this, like, how am I treated in that store? You'll find, I think, in a lot of communities, there are, for lack of a better word, a lot of cultural tensions between store owners and residents because they often come from different cultural, racial, or ethnic groups. In Cleveland, I would say 90% of our stores are owned by people of Middle Eastern descent, and they're operating in predominantly Black neighborhoods. And so there is definitely, and this has been going on for decades. I think in LA, you'll see Korean and Black African American tensions between store owners and residents in those communities, because residents aren't often participating in the ownership of those stores. So you have this, sometimes it's perceived, it's real, but the dynamics in terms of the environment of that community. Are they hiring people from my neighborhood? Are people able to move from cashier to manager in those stores? And then you have the community context, and then the actual experience of community members themselves. This is a project that we are currently working on where the residents are actually developing their own maps around food access in their community, where the fast food restaurants are, where the home meals are, where kids can access healthy food for after school programs, summer feeding programs, and also their experiences with those spaces. So it's not just dots on a map, it's how you use those spaces. It's, oftentimes the corner store and retail work we do is based on nominations of the people in that community. There might be 25 stores in that neighborhood, but they said, we go to these 3 stores, the owners are great to work with, they extend credit when we need it, they support our programs when we need it, they make donations to our community events. So really using kind of community to inform, I think, what the full story is that's happening in these neighborhoods. I wanted just to pop up a quick example here because I want to leave time for questions as well. So this is the Buckeye neighborhood, which is right here. So this is this store right here. And this is on Cleveland's east side. This used to be a Giant Eagle, which is a pretty major multi-state chain. They closed many stores in the city of Cleveland except for one. And this one was taken over by Simon's. It's located in the Buckeye Shaker neighborhood. There was a lot of protests by members, residents, and community leaders and advocates around the closing of the Giant Eagle and who was moving into that space. This grocer received public and private financing to reopen, but the response over in the community basically kind of put together, for lack of a better word, their own community benefits agreement, kind of their expectations of how that store would hire from the community, stock fresh produce, create space for people to have nutrition education or local entrepreneurs to have pop-ups. But once the store opened after several months, things did not go well. On the map, it looks like things are great, but there's major issues with expired food, freshness. Community has not been able to come in and do any kind of programming or community-based events inside the store. He basically said, I did all the things in your community benefits agreement, so we're done. And you drive by there on a Thursday afternoon, there might be 10 cars in the parking lot. And it's maybe a 35,000, 40,000 square foot store. And so folks in this neighborhood are often going outside of their neighborhood now to do shopping if they can and get a ride. So just kind of the limitations, I think, of just mapping and just looking at the environment without getting the people's story in that mix. It will tell you a completely, a different narrative when you bring those two things together. Before we kind of leave the retail space, I also wanted to share kind of a snapshot of this kind of continuing conversation in Cleveland around dollar stores. So there's a couple communities across the country that are imposing these moratoriums. And I don't know kind of what your communities look like, but they have gone, I don't know, tons of them have popped up in the city of Cleveland, I would say the last 5 years. Family Dollar, Dollar General, Dollar Tree. And so what the city of Cleveland decided to do back in 2020, they imposed a moratorium saying no more dollar stores in the city of Cleveland. We are done. Just to like pause and kind of figure out what the policy was going to be in the city of Cleveland. They said the reason that they were distinguishing dollar stores from independently locally owned stores is kind of that corporate decision-making hierarchy, that it's hard to get local stores to make any changes. They said they were irresponsible in terms of their impact on community when it came to crime, when it came to keeping things clean and tidy. There was like too much trash, and they didn't upkeep their stores the way that they had promised and committed to. And so they had imposed this moratorium for about a year and really studied the problem. And then in January of last year, decided to codify an ordinance banning dollar stores within 2 miles of another dollar store location. So basically tackling the density of dollar stores, because I don't know how that business works, but you'll see one on one corner and then the next block and then the next block. They're all there. There's like 3 within a 5-minute walking distance, and somehow they coexist. But the city said, no, we are capping development. If you want to locate a dollar store, it has to be at least 2 miles from an existing dollar store. And we also want to know what your store layout plan is. What products are you stocking? What kinds of foods do you have? So they really decided to impose some pretty strict regulations on dollar stores in the city of Cleveland. And so that's only been around about a little over a year now that it's been in practice. As with anything with the city, it's taken a little bit longer time to kind of figure out the processes behind it. What's the review for the inventory and the stocking and all of those pieces of it when it goes through planning review. But it's I think an interesting response from the city on figuring out how to manage this, because who are all of these dollar stores hurting in the end? Say again? Local, right? They hurt our local businesses, our grocery stores trying to compete, especially locally owned grocery stores trying to compete with these folks is really challenging because their supply chain is massive, right? Like they have hundreds and thousands of stores that they supply. So it hurts our local stores. They're also arguing that it hurts local community. It was actually some reporting in ProPublica. They did a really big deep dive into the impact of dollar stores on community, particularly from a crime and safety perspective, and just kind of blight perspective. That's really fascinating if you really want to dig into it. I think that ProPublica piece really pushed Cleveland to take a closer look at that. So that's kind of where this is now. Other communities across the country have also started to use zoning regulations as a way to kind of control dollar stores popping up in their communities as well. And so as we're kind of closing, we've talked a lot about this like broader context of what's happening in our community and how it affects community members and residents. But I also wanted to call out, like, how is the experience of children and youth different? And you kind of alluded to this with some of your questions, right? And there are some major differences, particularly in communities that are struggling economically in terms of where kids get food. And if you think about schools, we are a 100% free and reduced lunch or free lunch city here in Cleveland. So any kid, they don't have to prove anything, can get free breakfast and lunch at school. And so for a lot of kids, those 2 meals at school are really critical when it comes to their own nutritional needs. And so when you think about kids' breakfast and lunch in school, sometimes Cleveland has expanded and is now doing dinner programs and supper programs at several of their school sites. We've got after-school programs with snacks for kids. So kids in Cleveland, many kids are getting most of their meals outside of the home, right? schools, after school programs, summer feeding programs in the summertime. And then the other interesting piece is corner and convenience stores. We have, as we've been talking about, they are scattered throughout the city, and there's often one on your way to school. And so there's some interesting data that came out of Philadelphia back in 2015, who's done a lot of work with corner and convenience stores, finding that half of youth that live in urban neighborhoods at least make one trip a week, at least one. They're spending about $1 on average, and with that $1, they're getting about 350 calories. So when we think about the opportunity to work with young people and engage them in this work and kind of interrupt their purchasing habits at corner stores, my guess, I was surprised it's only half. I would think it would be a lot higher than that based on just kind of what I see with kids in my neighborhood and stopping at corner stores. But still, this is a whole, I think, story that we don't really talk about, right? And this is like $1. Those bags of chips are often marketed at 25 cents, 50 cents. You got the little juices that aren't really juice. They're just like colored sugar water for 25 cents. So when we talk about them making their own choices and having their own agency, the opportunity to change that is really in those small stores that are in their neighborhood. But oftentimes they aren't a part of that conversation. So how do we, I think, engage more young people in kind of that neighborhood food retail environment, what their stories are, what they're looking for, what they'd be willing to purchase, and what that looks like. So in one of our stores, we are there kind of at the transition from school to after school. So we'll actually see kids that are coming into the store and have some good conversations with young people around their choices too. And so kind of that kind of bigger question when we think about, in a lot of our communities, how much they're influenced by institutional food and federally funded food programs, it is huge. That's a whole, I think, element that we often kind of miss in terms of how we cover food access stories, is really around, and you were bringing this up around school meal programs and kind of a lot of the foundational work that First Lady Michelle Obama did with her Let's Move initiative to change a lot of the guidelines around healthy food. But I think sometimes, kind of to your point, I think both of you kind of made this, we'll often then kind of change the recipe. And with our team, we did some food waste audits at the Cleveland Public Schools. I think we were in about 6 schools just standing by the garbage can to see what kids threw away. Some cases, and these are kids that need food, 75% of that food went into the wastebasket. But it was a whole wheat waffle in a cellophane bag, sweaty, with nothing to put on it. Like, I wouldn't want to eat that either. That sounds like cardboard, right? That doesn't sound great. But so you've got kids that need this nutrition, and oftentimes our institutional systems and how they're funded and the resources that receive aren't meeting the needs of kids where they're at. And so I think when we think about children and youth, we need to think about how they're interacting with their neighborhood and home environment, and also how they're impacting with these huge federal programs. And as many of you might know, this is the year of the Farm Bill. This is when a lot of the stuff comes into play. I think based on, the DC politics right now, we don't know if we will actually have a Farm Bill this year or next year. But I think, is it 70% of the Farm Bill is actually SNAP. It's not really about farm subsidies. It's around nutrition titles and getting access for children and families and seniors to the foods that they need. And so I guess kind of my challenge to you as you are out there reporting is, how do we get more, because we know that the way that youth interact and children interact with our food system is different. It's very different. And so how do we elevate their voice in these stories and what their experiences are? I can't remember the last time I read a story on food access, food justice, food sovereignty that was youth focused around how they're accessing healthy food, what it's like to go to school. We've seen the pictures of school meals. We know what the administrators say. We know what parents say. But we don't often ask young people what they want and what their experience is and what they would like to see. So that's kind of my challenge as you're writing your stories, to really kind of bring that to the forefront. And just wanted to kind of share my contact information. I'm happy to be a resource to you all and anything that you're working on. And we can open it up for questions. Yeah.
So, back during the Obama administration, I'm Bonnie Petrie with Texas Public Radio, by the way. There was a ton of pushback with the First Lady trying to approve school lunches and the White House garden. Is that just a figment of the press, or is that pushback a real thing? Why do you think that exists? And do you have to fight it?
So why? So in the Obama administration, we made they made some bold moves when it came to food. And you're saying, why was the pushback, and was that pushback real or perceived? I think some of that pushback was real. And looking as to where we are now, it's interesting to look about, and I'm totally just off the cuff here with you, as I'm thinking about your question. I think about how the Democrats infringe on our freedom and are telling us what to do. And I almost think a lot of the pushback around dietary guidelines with school lunch are almost a part of that conversation around too much government in our lives and regulating us, and we should have the freedom to choose. Don't tell me what to do. Right? Yeah. It's an interesting question. I also just think that there's also race, I think, wrapped up in that question around Michelle, like we're on a first name basis, First Lady Obama, spearheading a lot of that work when agriculture is traditionally seen as a very white, rural kind of space, right? And she was really pushing an agenda that was focused on nutrition, families, urban areas, bringing gardening to the White House. So I think it had racial politics involved, cultural politics. But it's hard for me as someone who sees kind of what our kids and families are struggling with and the things that imagine alone if for young people, they were getting the freshest, healthiest meals possible at school for breakfast and lunch. That would make a huge difference. We still have to figure out what's happening at the neighborhood level when it comes to the meals at home, but that would just impact so many millions of kids across the country if their best meals were coming from school. How anyone can argue against that, I don't know. I wish I had a better answer for you.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Morgan Taggart for expanding our consciousness about the issue of food, justice, sovereignty, insecurity in ways that I thought I knew a lot, but now I know a lot more. And so let's show Morgan our appreciation for joining us. And that concludes the second Future of the American Child journalism training here in Cleveland. Thank you all for participating, and we know that you'll produce some marvelous content. I'd like to take one more time to thank our sponsors, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and the Heising Simons Foundation. We're looking forward to our third training, which will be held in Charlotte, North Carolina later this year. And for more information, keep watch at our website at nationalpress.org. Thank you.